Our guest is Professor Shay Dawson, PhD, Associate Professor and Program Director from Central Michigan University. Professor Dawson, would you please introduce yourself regarding your professional background and the current area of expertise?
Hi, I'm Dr. Shay Dawson, and I'm an Associate Professor at Central Michigan University in the major of Recreational Therapy and Rehabilitation. I also am the Program Director for a minor in Disability Studies and Community Inclusion. And finally, I work in the medical school as an adjunct faculty teaching future physicians how to work with patients that have disabilities.
Thank you. Based on previous experience, what is your opinion on the impact of physical exercise on the development of other psychomotor functions of persons with ASD, such as speech, language, cognitive, and sensory abilities?
Yeah, I think, recreational therapy is very much positioned to address this issue. Using physical activities, recreation, things like that with clients that have autism is really a novel way to get at these other therapeutic outcomes. I'll give you a couple examples. I was working with Agape Therapeutic Writing Center, and we were working with an individual with autism. And what they ended up doing is they're using therapeutic writing and physical activities with the horse, and the client was having a hard time communicating and using his words, had never used words in a meaningful way. But what ended up happening is through these physical activities with the horse, they realized that when they said walk on, that was the command for this 1,000-pound animal to move. And it gave power to those words. And so all of a sudden, the client starts developing language based on this physical activity they've been doing on a weekly basis. Another example is the Ability Center in Toledo, Ohio, has a program called Agility Dog, it's Agility Angels with dogs, so a canine assisted therapy program. And they use sort of the dogs to get people with autism to do physical activities, but also cognitive activities. So they'll train a dog for, say 7-8 weeks, and they have to take them through an agility course. So they're running with the dog, they're giving the dog commands, they're developing language, they're also doing physical activity, but they also need to cognitively know, I have to go to this station first, and then this station, and then this station, because you're training the dog in a sequential way. And so those types of activities, the client is not thinking about, I'm improving my cognitive domain, I'm improving my, receptive language and my expressive language. They're just thinking, this is a great experience with a dog that I'm connecting with. And so I think in those ways, it's quite useful approach to developing these other therapeutic goals in a more meaningful way.
How much does physical exercise, generally speaking, impact the quality of life of persons with ASD?
Yeah, I think you have to look at just general population studies on what does exercise do to us as humans, right? And what we found in the last 10 to 15 years is there's more and more studies connecting physical exercise and activity to lower depression and anxiety outcomes, right? And so we know that if you exercise and do physical activity, it's in controlled studies, it's just as good as an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication. And so the power of exercise on our mental health is really strong. And we know that anecdotally. If we're having a stressful day and we can go out and exercise, it clears our minds. We feel better, our quality of life goes up. The problem with autism is that we end up having many barriers for autistic individuals to actually get into physical activity. And so they're missing out on all those quality of life outcomes, not to mention the social connections that we have on sports teams. Let's say there's a 10-year-old and they're on a youth football team, right? There's lots of social network connections there as well. And we know that social connection reduces loneliness. But those are all issues for folks that are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder.
What should the professionals focus on when organizing and implementing physical activities for persons with ASD?
I'd say probably one of the number one things that we will really teach future practitioners to do is look at the sensory needs of individuals. So typically one of the major barriers to getting into recreation or physical activities are that the sensory environment is not conducive. It's too loud, it's maybe irritating them in some way. And so looking at those sensory support needs is very helpful. There was a project out of the University of Kansas by Dr. Lisa Lawson and her colleague. She's a recreational therapist. She also works with her colleague who's an occupational therapist. And what they've developed is the sensory supported swimming program. It's a great example to answer this question. They have essentially looked at how do we get people with autism spectrum disorder into swimming, because the drowning rates for those individuals is much higher. They tend to be drawn to, a lot of people are drawn to water when you have autism, and it's a great physical activity. And so they teach them to swim, but there are many barriers. If the water's too cold, they might put on a wetsuit. If it's too loud inside with the noises of the fans and the pools, they'll give them maybe earplugs. They might give them a nose plug if it's the sensory experience of that water rushing into their noses too much. They make the environment conducive. It might only be 1 or 2 people in the pool instead of having 30 or 40 kids. And what they end up finding through their research is that those kids enter into swimming and are able to swim, learn how to swim, and use that as exercise in a safer way and with a higher level of success through supporting those sensory needs first.
Based on your experience, do you believe that sports and recreational activities can contribute to their social inclusion? And if so, could you please elaborate on it?
Yeah, I think sport in general has been a catalyst for social inclusion of many marginalized groups historically. If you look at the movement of of women in the United States, sport is one way that was helpful. We see that with disability now, and we see that folks being able to take part in disability-specific programs or inclusive programs are quite helpful. So I like to use the Special Olympics model for this. Special Olympics is a kind of a disability-specific model where we take folks with intellectual disabilities, we'll put them into sports, and it's conducive to that group, and they're able to participate. But now the Special Olympics has taken one step further, and they have the unified kind of sport model, where they're going into high schools and they're pairing individuals with disabilities with students without disabilities, and they're doing track teams together. So you might have a relay race where you have 2 individuals that have autism and 2 that do not have autism, and they're running that relay race and competing against other teams. So you see a very true inclusive model of people with and without disabilities. So those are just a couple examples. There are so many more. One last example would be, just seeing individuals in these sports and excelling at a very high level, right? If they're climbing a mountain or they're running a marathon, that breaks down those barriers in society of people thinking that they can't do things, and they see that, they can if they have the opportunity.
What are the preconditions for more intensive and successful integration of individuals with ASD into sports and recreational activities in the community? How can we, as professionals, contribute to fulfilling these preconditions?
Yeah, I think preconditions, when you're looking at getting into more intensified participation, right? Longer term, longer days and weeks and training and things like that, you have to have sort of self-determined nature about it. Just like anybody, if I ask you to do something difficult, if you enjoy that activity, you're going to do that one more so than one you may not. So I think the number one thing we need to do is assess the client on what are their interests. Instead of me saying, hey, client A, I'm going to have you do basketball today. why not present 4 or 5 options? And if they pick basketball, now they're self-determined in doing that. And we know through Deci and Ryan's research with self-determination theory that when somebody has a choice, they become more self-determined. And then John Datillo took that one step further with his model of recreational therapy and enjoyment enhancement, that if you give them a choice, then they become more intrinsically motivated, and then they enjoy the activity more, and they're going to stick with it. And so we need to assess clients. Instead of telling them what to do, we need to find their interest and give them options. I had a professor when I was in college, and one of his techniques was he would put activities in this corner of the gym, activities in this corner, this corner, and this corner, 4 different options, and he was ready to facilitate all 4, but he would bring the client into the room and just see what they gravitate towards. If they go over to this corner, we're ready to go with that, right? So that's that self-determination and intrinsic motivation.
And to wrap up this interview, could you share some of your key experiences and of implementing sports and recreational activities when working with persons with ASD?
Yeah, I think 2 examples come to mind. One, American-style camps. I was the director of Bradford Woods, where we run camps for youth and adults with disabilities, and we did have a camp for 80 youth that had ASD. And so what we ended up doing in that camp, it was a week-long camp. Before they would arrive the day before, we would spend the entire day creating 2 sensory experiences. We would have a building that would have low sensory needs, so very calming, relaxed light, very much kind of relaxing for them, right, to calm them down. And then we'd have another building where the sensory experience inside of there was more alerting. It was throwing a ball that's heavy. It's being able to crash into a crash mat. And what we find is individuals with ASD tend to have a high sensory need or a low sensory need. And those 2 rooms were very helpful for the success of that camp. So as they came into camp, we would assess them. Do they need this high sensory need or the low sensory? And as they were elevating behaviors in camp, maybe they were becoming agitated, they were withdrawing, we would allow them then to go into their sensory experience of choice, and that would help regulate them. They might need 30 to 60 minutes in there. Then they could return back to the camp activities, and they were much more successful. So that's one example. Another is a partnership with Daniela Tamash at the University of Novi Sad and some of our partners in the United States. We developed the Galloping Towards Success Equine-Assisted Learning Program. It was all off the horse. We used horses, but we had many different things that they would need to do. We had 5 individuals with autism in Serbia, and then we ran the program in the United States with 5 individuals that have autism as well at that kind of severe to moderate assessment range. And what we found is over the course of 13 to 14 weeks, we noticed that their autism symptoms started to go down as they went through this program of equine-assisted therapy, of leading the horse around, doing different obstacles, different things that were physical activity-based, but also cognitive in nature and sensory in nature. And we found that that program was quite successful and quite useful for individuals with autism, especially in that moderate range where there's not a lot of programs. There's, it's a lot of programs for folks that have low support needs that tend to be higher functioning, but when you get in that lower spectrum and higher support needs, there's not as many programs. And that Galloping Towards Success program, equine-assisted therapy, ended up working out quite well.
Professor Dawson, thank you very much for the interview.
Thanks for having me.